Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1950s Galactic Chorus, the uniform message of the atomic age. While the messengers of the 1950s contactee movement were wildly diverse, ranging from highway workers in Nevada and assembly line laborers in Los Angeles to British occultists and South African meteorologists, their narratives displayed a striking, almost coordinated thematic uniformity. Whether channeled in a desert shack in esoteric London lecture hall or glimpsed in the South African sky, the core signal remained singular. Humanity was perched at a dangerous evolutionary precipice. The phenomenon of contactees in the mid-20th century, individuals who claimed to receive telepathic or physical instructions from extraterrestrial visitors, produced a body of literature and testimony that, while often dismissed as folklore, bears a startling thematic consistency. This consistency, emerging from disparate corners of the globe, suggests a shared narrative structure regarding humanity's place in the universe. The central pillar of this cosmic council was a clinical, often sobering diagnosis of a human condition in the wake of 1945. These extraterrestrials, whether purported to be from Venus, Mars, or distant systems like Medon or Clarion, viewed the atomic bomb not as a triumphant technological achievement, but as an ontological crisis. The core argument presented by these entities was that humanity had experienced a technological leapfrogging that far outpaced our psychological and spiritual evolution. We had attained the power to alter the fabric of spacetime, to manipulate the fundamental building blocks of matter, before we had mastered the ability to live in peace with our neighbors. The visitors frequently characterize humanity as an aggressive tribal adolescent. Like a child who finds a loaded firearm in the home, humanity was seen as playing with dangerous toys it didn't yet understand. The diagnostic view was clear. We were a species in the middle of a self-destructive phase, possessing the destructive capability of a planetary god, but the conflict resolution skills of a feudal tribe. The visitors framed Earth's newly acquired nuclear status as a danger, not just to ourselves, but to the neighborhood. The concern was that a nuclear war on Earth would have ripple effects, not only in terms of atmospheric and environmental degradation, but potentially through the disruption of etheric or dimensional fields. We had become a liability in the cosmic community, a volatile element in a sector that otherwise favored stability and equilibrium. What fascinates researchers and historians is the lack of centralized communication among these contactees. In the 1950s, without the internet or global mass media to synchronize narratives, how did individuals in California, England, Brazil, and Japan all report the same specific urgent warnings? Whether the contact was reported by a farmer in the Midwest or a scientist in Europe, the message remained remarkably dry and analytical. The visitors did not generally speak in theological terms. They spoke in mechanistic terms, describing Earth as a disturbed system that needed recalibration. Every contactee narrative from this era shares a specific diagnosis. The problem is not your machines, the problem is your consciousness. They argued that if humanity did not achieve a fundamental shift in awareness, moving away from competition, nationalism, and resource hoarding toward unity, the technology would inevitably lead to our self-extinction. Skeptics might argue this was a zeitgeist effect, a cultural reflection of post-war nuclear anxiety. However, the depth of the detail provided in these early accounts, descriptions of atomic physics, the structure of the solar system, and the interconnectedness of biological life suggests a level of sophistication that was, at the very least, a remarkably high-level synthesis of 1950s-era futurism. The messages consistently position these visitors as caretakers or observers. They were not interested in invading or colonizing Earth. They were interested in containment. The Space Brothers frequently claimed they were prevented from direct intervention by a law of non-interference. They were effectively forbidden from saving us from ourselves because they believed that true progress must come from within the species. Thus, their role was limited to broadcasting warnings and monitoring our nuclear sites. The message was clear. Earth was at a crossroads. We were being tested to see if we would use our atomic discovery to power our society or to terminate our existence. The atomic precipice was not just a threat. It was the ultimate examination of a maturing civilization. This narrative provided the blueprint for the UAP discourse we see today. When modern whistleblowers or high-level intelligence officials speak about UAPs hovering over nuclear silos, they are echoing the exact same planetary diagnosis recorded by contactees 70 years ago. The consistency of this message across decades suggests that, for better or worse, the atomic precipice has been the central theme of our relationship with the unknown since the dawn of the nuclear age. The message is delivered by mid-century contactees, despite being filtered through disparate individual consciousnesses, displayed a startlingly coherent metaphysics of survival. Whether the messenger was a simple laborer or a trained engineer, the underlying warning remained rooted in a binary choice between two divergent trajectories: evolution or extinction. The Space Brothers utilized a terminology that bypassed cultural or religious dogma, opting instead for a framework that sounded more like applied physics and systems theory. They were not preaching sin and salvation. They were describing equilibrium and thermodynamics. The path of light was described not as a mystical, ethereal state, but as the technological and biological integration of a society. The core tenet was that advanced civilizations do not separate their science from their philosophy. They argued that a society that achieves interstellar travel is, by definition, one that has achieved internal peace. They viewed the path of light as the natural evolution of consciousness. As a species learns more about the mechanics of the universe, their moral responsibility for their environment and each other must grow proportionally. The contactees consistently reported that these visitors viewed Earth as a living library. The path of light involved acting as a caretaker of the planet's biosphere, which they viewed as a complex, interconnected living system. Environmental destruction was described not just as a bad policy, but as an act of species-wide suicide. The path of entropy was the antithesis of the cosmic order. It was characterized by the reckless, unmanaged expansion of energy. In this lexicon, materialism and greed were framed as social friction. Just as excessive friction in a machine generates heat and eventually causes the system to seize up, they argued that excessive human greed caused systemic instability in society. This was the visitors' deepest grievance. They viewed humanity as a species that had gained the keys to the engine room nuclear power without first learning how to steer the ship. They described this as a condition of spiritual entropy, where society creates more chaos and destruction than it does order and harmony. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these messages was the concept of the correction. It was rarely presented as a vengeful judgment by a deity, but rather as an inevitable consequence of cosmic law. This is the most crucial detail in the contactee literature. The visitors often explain their non-interference policy by comparing humanity to a pathogen. If a biological organism is attacked by a virus, the immune system eventually creates a response to neutralize the threat to save the body. They describe the path of entropy as a systemic infection. If humanity continued to behave like a cancer on the face of the planet, consuming resources, destroying its home, and radiating violence, the universe would, by necessity, isolate or clear the pathogen. The message was profoundly fatalistic. The universe is a self-correcting system. If a species cannot harmonize its technological power with its moral baseline, it will invariably hit a great filter, a term coined by modern cosmologists, but present in contactee literature 70 years ago. They weren't threatening to kill us, semicolon. They were warning us that we had built a trap for ourselves and that we were about to trip the wire. The fact that Daniel Fry, the rocket engineer in the American desert, and Elizabeth Clarer, the meteorologist in South Africa, described the exact same systemic risk is what continues to haunt researchers. They weren't just describing UFOs, they were describing a cosmic audit. The Space Brothers presented themselves as the auditors. They were not looking at our bank accounts or our borders, they were looking at our energy balance sheet. They saw a species that was spending its capital on weapons, wasting its time on trivial conflicts, and ignoring the systemic decay of its environment. In the contactee narrative, the path of light wasn't just a moral imperative, it was the only way to survive the technical era. It was the cosmic equivalent of telling an adolescent that they have to learn to control their impulses before they are allowed to drive a car on the highway. If they refuse to learn, the accident is inevitable, not because the road is evil, but because the driver is unprepared. The mid-century contactee phenomenon serves as a masterclass in cultural translation. While the core signal, the urgent warning regarding atomic entropy and the path of light, was remarkably consistent, the delivery system for that message was entirely localized. These extraterrestrial narratives acted as a cultural prism, where the same cosmic light entered the experience but was refracted into vastly different colors based on the society, tradition, and personal history of the individual contactee. In the United States, the contactee narrative was heavily influenced by the post-World War II political environment. America was in the throes of the Red Scare, a booming industrial revolution, and an unprecedented trust and later suspicion of the state. Figures like Daniel Fry, a propulsion engineer, and George Van Tassel, a former aviation mechanic, framed the extraterrestrial arrival in terms of oversight. They saw the UFOs not as spiritual deities, but as an advanced, objective, and perhaps democratic third party overseeing the planet. The message was framed as a critique of government secrecy. In the American context, the UFO was an interventionist force, meant to balance the military-industrial complex. It reflected the quintessential American value of individual liberty, and the suspicion of centralized, unaccountable power. The visitors were cosmic constitutionalists here to remind the government that there are laws higher than the states. In the United Kingdom, the contactee movement, most notably represented by George King and the Etheria Society, took on a profoundly different texture. Britain's long history of occultism, ceremonial magic, and theosophy provided a fertile, structured soil for the message. George King, a master of yoga, channeled the Space Brothers through a structured framework of discipline, mantras, and hierarchy. Here, the visitors were not just observers or technicians, they were ascended masters. The Etheria Society integrated UFO contact into a roadmap of spiritual evolution that mirrored the rigid hierarchical structures of British esoteric traditions. It was a message of duty and training. The UFO was the vehicle, but the practice was the path, requiring rigorous mental focus, yoga, and meditation. It turned ufology into a form of cosmic civic service, where the contactee's role was to act as an antenna for cosmic intelligence. In South Africa and Latin America, the contactee narrative intersected with societies where the boundaries between the physical world and the spirit world are traditionally much more porous. Elizabeth Clarer, South Africa, and Aladino Felix, Brazil, presented accounts that felt less like a briefing by a technician and more like a transcendental journey. Clarer's accounts were intensely personal and emotional, describing a romance with a being from Medan and the beauty of the celestial realms. In Brazil, figures like Felix often tied the contactee experience to spiritism, a highly influential metaphysical tradition in Brazil. The UFO was not seen as a machine from another planet in a purely material sense, but as a bridge between dimensions. The contactee was not an engineer or student, but a medium. In this prism, the extraterrestrials were viewed as highly evolved spirits or entities that had transitioned beyond the physical plane entirely, making the contact experience an exercise in metaphysical union rather than geopolitical warning. Why this prism effect matters? This regional variation is exactly what makes the phenomenon so difficult for historians to categorize. If the messages were entirely artificial, government psyops, we might expect a more uniform, propagandistic message. If the messages were purely delusional, we might expect them to be entirely chaotic and incoherent. Instead, we see a uniform core message: stop the atomic destruction, choose the path of light, trust in the specific local dialect of the person receiving it. It suggests that the phenomenon may be interactive, that it utilizes the contactee's own subconscious language and cultural background to ensure the message is digestible enough to be communicated. The contactee movement wasn't just about alien visitors. It was a global, decentralized conversation about humanity's future, conducted in the native tongues of democracy, mysticism, and spiritualism. It reveals that humanity didn't just want a saucer to land. We wanted a mirror to understand who we were becoming in the shadow of the atomic age. The concept of watchful waiting is the final, unifying intellectual bridge in mid-century contactee literature. It successfully shifted the burden of Earth's destiny from an external force, the alien, to an internal mandate, the individual human being. This philosophy effectively transformed the UFO phenomenon from a series of spooky stories into a global movement of psychological accountability. The most striking subversion within these narratives was the rejection of the savior archetype. In almost every major religion or secular political ideology, humanity looks for a savior, a messiah, a government, a technological fix, or a revolutionary leader. The Space Brothers, as reported by contactees, adamantly refused this role. The contactees consistently reported that the visitors claimed they could not intervene, even if they wanted to. They cited a cosmic law of free will or a non-interference directive. This was a brilliant rhetorical stroke. It meant that the visitors were not saving us, because that would rob us of the choice to save ourselves. By positioning themselves as observers, the visitors shifted the pressure back onto the human observer. If the Space Brothers were just watching, then the consequence of nuclear war was entirely ours to own. This forced individuals to stop waiting for a government, a god, or an extraterrestrial to fix the world and realize that the responsibility lay in their own hands. This narrative created a unique psychological demographic, the contacted elite. Long before the era of digital social movements, these contactees formed a global, decentralized network. They were people who felt they had peeked behind the curtain of reality. They were no longer just citizens of a country, they were citizens of the cosmos. This realization served as a powerful cognitive reframing. By believing they were in contact with an advanced, harmonious society, the contactees began to model their own lives on what they perceived to be universal values. They weren't just waiting for the aliens to arrive, they were trying to live in a way that would make them compatible with such an arrival. In retrospect, the uniformity of the watchful waiting message highlights a profound social mechanism: projection. The mid-negative 1950s was a time of immense collective trauma. Humanity had just emerged from the most destructive war in history and immediately faced the total annihilation of the Cold War. We were terrified, and we had no adequate vocabulary for that fear. The stars became the only screen vast and blank enough to project that fear onto. By articulating their fears through the mouths of Space Brothers, humanity was able to talk about the dangers of the atomic age without triggering the paranoia of government censors or religious authorities. If a Venusian warned of nuclear fallout, it was a cosmic message. If a scientist warned of nuclear fallout, it was communist propaganda. The contactee movement provided a safe harbor for humanity to discuss its own potential suicide. The 1950s contactee movement was arguably the first global planetary awareness movement in history. Before the environmental movement, before the global peace marches, and before the internet, the contactees were the first to argue that Earth was a single, fragile unit. They were the first to treat the planet as a spaceship, and the humans as a crew that needed to learn how to stop fighting if they wanted to survive the journey. The watchful waiting paradox remains as relevant today as it was in 1955. The intelligence, whether extraterrestrial or psychological, refused to solve our problems. They stood back and let us struggle. Whether the visitors were real in a physical sense or a myth, generated by the collective human subconscious, the effect was the same. They forced us to stare into the mirror of the night sky and ask, if we are watched, are we worthy of what they see? This question is the ghost in the machine of modern ufology. It is why, even in 2026, we remain obsessed with the watchful waiting of the UAPs. We are still waiting for the older siblings to reveal themselves, but perhaps we are also still terrified that they have been watching us the entire time, waiting for us to stop playing with matches. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archived Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown, Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.